All right, welcome. Welcome to the live event. Today I'll be talking about the connection between seven-step reset and dynamic leadership, and also bringing in why I'm using dynamic leadership as the ideal leadership system for small business owners. Uh, if you go out to sevenstepreset.com/live, I've got a video of so far like 400 infographics. That's just scaling through on a video. You can stop it anywhere and look at the infographics. I have like over 600 of them. I started collecting them in August. And the reason is because there's so much focus on more information, getting more information, but we don't use what we already know. And I say to know and not do is not much better than not knowing. If 95% of everything we do is done by habit, and we're focused on learning more information, the incremental value, the incremental utility of that additional information is very, very small because only 5% is from the conscious. And the worst part about it is that as we get triggered or as we get into a compromised state, we use even less of what we know. So what we want to do is base our leadership on automaticity, on habits. We want to have habits following that. So there's a great book, Primal Leadership, on emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence, I remember starting 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, that started becoming a big deal. And it's still deeper and deeper and deeper. And the way it's presented, it's almost like leaders are going to be able to remember, okay, now that's going on in my basal ganglia, and then I have to do this before it gets to the prefrontal cortex, and I have to adjust the perception of the amygdala. It's not going to happen. That whole network, the network of neurons, aka subconscious, right? That's what's been called subconscious for hundreds of years, but now through scanning tools, we know it's the network of neurons. That whole process is happening in milliseconds. The network of neurons processes at 11 million bits per second. Conscious mind only processes it at 50 bits per second. So you can see the dilemma here. We are using knowledge to inform how we're supposed to behave, but if we get triggered, and I'm using triggered loosely, the point is once we get primed for fight or flight, it's already on that path. The nice thing about the seven-step reset is that once you see it in yourself, once you work it in yourself, you'll see it in other people instantly. And that's where the emotional intelligence comes in. But we need to do it at the habit level, not at the knowledge level. Like I can't expect leaders to be thinking about, should I be using an affiliative style now, or is it democratic style, or maybe I should be in an authoritarian style? You're not going to be able to do that. So dynamic leadership moves along the continuum from, you can say, performance-driven leadership and people-centered leadership. Another way to look at it is command and control and servant leadership is how we can get results done. And dynamic leadership moves along that continuum as needed. And it's based on the current situation. And the current situation is a balance of what are the objectives, what do I need, and what do the people need? As pointed out in emotional intelligence, you'll see that affiliative leadership, everybody accepts that has limitations. Democratic leadership has limitations, but also authoritative leadership has limitations. Command and control has limitations. Having been in the U.S. Army Special Ops, Army Ranger training, etc., and then sales and sales operations, where we're using incentives to drive behavior, I saw firsthand the limitations of both. And dynamic leadership addresses that. So the seven-step reset, and you can go out to, I put in the chat the link, sevenstepreset.com/live. So that's out there in the chat. You can go to that site, and I have been doing live events on the seven-step reset for the last 2 or 3 weeks. I'll continue through December. Then we're going to go from the self and then to, let me just jot some of this down. So we're going to go from self to one, and then one to many. So we have to, when you're talking about leadership, we have to start with ourselves. So you have personal leadership, then you have leading others, and this is your guidance and accountability. And you have culture, setting the culture, one to many. So this is what we're doing. In December, I'm talking about 7-step reset. And this is about making it automatic for us to regulate. So if you look at what emotional intelligence teaches, and I'm not knocking emotional intelligence, that's baked in here. But when you look at what it teaches, it's most of it is after the fact. So if you're in a steady state and then you get triggered into a fight or flight, to get back to focus and engage in the moment, you need some very special skills. And we teach that in the 7-step reset. Ideally, what you want to do is have your automaticity set up so that fight or flight is very, very seldom hit. Remember, fight or flight is there for like a Serengeti tiger type threat. Very, very few people have Serengeti tiger type threats on a yearly basis or even in a decade. I don't think most people have that kind of a threat. And so why do we need that much fighter, that much energy, that much adrenaline, that much cortisol for that kind of fight or flight? So what we want is the automaticity to tone down the subconscious bias towards looking for threat. We want to tone that down to where the majority of things that come through are neutral, and then there are a few that require attention. So what we're going to do is in the personal, we're going to shift from flight to focus and engage. When you watch those videos where people are getting startled by a bush or some prank or whatever, you'll see there's a difference between the fight or flight where people jump and run and literally their body takes over. And that body is taking over based on what it learned from 0 to 7. So if they were around a very emotional person, a pretty dramatic, you might see them doing more jumping in action. When you look at anybody who's been trained in special ops, you look at martial arts masters, when they're faced with a threat, you don't see the fight or flight. What you see is focus and engage. You focus and engage and then decide. You know, they say Marines, Rangers, Navy SEALs, they run towards the gunfire. It's not that they're running towards the gunfire willy-nilly. It's that the assessment is that they have to retake the initiative. They have to gain the initiative and put the enemy on the defense. So focus and engage, and we want that automatic. So that's going to happen. And by doing that, by getting to that point where we're focus and engage, we are no longer running the risk of running into an anxiety spiral ourselves. So leading ourselves is number one. And once you have that leadership, then the next thing we're going to do is leading others. And here, I'm going to use self-determination theory. Self-determination theory talks about Self-determination theory talks about the difference between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. And I would say that a leader's responsibility is to create an environment, whether that's one-on-one, and I say one-to-one, by the way. When I say one-to-one, this is 8 times, right? So if you have a span of control of 8 to 1, you're doing one-to-one 8 times. That's because leadership it starts with first getting the person enrolled into the vision. And you're going to do that on a one-to-one, having one-to-one conversations. I'll get into that's what we'll be doing in January. So in January, I'll start with the self-determination share theory part of dynamic leadership, leading others. We'll be looking at those one-to-one conversations, calibrating where they are so you can tell instantly when they're going into threat mode. And it happens very quickly. So from the time the person goes from I'm concerned to I'm scared, it's milliseconds. Like I said, the AKA, the network of neurons, AKA subconscious, processes at 11 million bits per second. And what's worse is that there's a priming part of it that happens even before the fight or flight, even before the stimulus. Let's see if I can get this screen a little bigger. So if you think about, and you can see this in the 7-step, you'll see this in the 7-step reset. Step 1 is your development. Step 2 is your check-in. Step 3 is the stimulus response area. And in that stimulus response area, so we have the stimulus and we have the conditioned reaction. This is a quarter of a second. But what happens is before the stimulus occurs, there's an ongoing assessment of what's going on. This is why if you look into neuroscience work, you'll see that if they're saying if you're stressed out, go outside, go through a doorway. And the subconscious causes you to start looking around because it's always looking at the environment. So if the stimulus happens here, there's this pre-stimulus, this priming period. And in this priming, what happens, the body's already prepared for what might come, and it's got a bias. As a leader, you want to understand for sure. You want to understand what it looks like when a person is going into concern mode. We're not going to deal with this. Once the stimulus happens, conditioned reaction, that's the person. You're not going to change that. You can change the environment. So steps 4, 5, 6, 7, we can work on here, and eventually improve their number 1. And that's where the leader lives. The leader lives in 7, 1, 2, and getting that steady state going. And the reason why I talked about having one-to-one many times, right, is because you're going to calibrate how that person shows up when they're feeling a little bit concerned. And I'm sorry, you're going to calibrate how they show up when they're not concerned at all, when they feel safe. And you want to notice when that changes. Now, you won't know what that change is. You won't know what they're feeling, but you'll notice that there was a shift. And then in this part of it, their state. So again, you can take a look at all those videos that go into detail on all of these steps. But you want to notice their state because this is the pre. So if the leader's paying attention to this, when I talk about dynamic leadership, sits on that continuum between people needs and performance-driven needs, it's because we're noticing what's going on. It doesn't mean that you back off on accountability. It doesn't mean that you back off on the vision. It doesn't mean that you take all their suggestions. What it means is that when they're If they're in a lower, so you have 0, 1, 2, -1, -2. If they're going into a -2 or 3 area in terms of their comfort level, their state, they are getting prepped for survival response. And if you have a survival response, you're going to have some problems with adrenaline, with the cortisol, with the triggering event. If you ever watch somebody get triggered, you see how fast it scales. And that triggering is because the network of neurons is just firing. And you've heard neurons that fire together wire together. Well, the ones that wire together also fire together. And so anxiety takes on this massive exponential increase in intensity, and it's very, very hard to get it back. Much easier to not go there in the first place, and that's why this is important. This is similar in sales as well. You'll see this happening in sales, as salespeople will pay attention to what's going on with the prospect in this stage and avoid those electrified tiles, if you will, because we don't want to have a survival response. So this is where that's where the next step will be. January, I'll be talking about the self-determination theory, but it's all aligned with emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is the backdrop. And emotional intelligence exists because of what we're taught in the self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is deep, deep research, and I want to say it around late 60s, early 70s. Emotional intelligence is designed the way it is because of intrinsic motivation, what gets intrinsic motivation, and that's borne out in the self-determination theory. So we're going to start there, and here's the idea. Rather than learn all of this information about emotional intelligence and try to, figure out where am I in this particular point in time, by using the self-determination theory, the 3 pillars, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, by focusing on that, what you're doing is looking at it from the top down and seeing in real time, instantaneously, and it becomes a habit that you're monitoring where the person is from an autonomy, competence, relatedness standpoint. If they slip on relatedness, that's going to very quickly lead to some threat or some fear concerns. And once a person feels unsafe, then it's going to be hard for them to hear what you're saying. You're going to eventually lose them in terms of their performance and in terms of their engagement. And this is why it's so important to do the 7-step reset as the leader and be certain that no matter how much chaos is around them, they're going to be able to self-regulate because it's automatic. We want the self-regulation to be as automatic as the survival response. You're essentially replacing the survival response with the fight or flight to focus and engage. But the bigger change is that we're changing the bias of the subconscious to look for threats and to perceive things as threats. So the subconscious looks at the unfamiliar as a threat. And because it goes so fast, before you even get to recognize that what this unfamiliarity is, it's already off and running. And that will do that automatically. You'll see that in the 7th step. Now, you can't do that for your people. But what you can do for your people is work on the state side of it, because if you can keep the state in a calm, mindful area, at least in a zone, then you're going to have fewer survival responses. And that's what you can do with your people. And the more you do that, the more they learn. So people have difficulty learning and adopting new behaviors when they're threatened. Very much like cells. Cells are either in growth mode or protective mode. They can't be in both. So when your internal environment is stressed out, toxic, compromised, your cells actually go into protective mode and they're not seeking nutrients. This is how illnesses can can kind of escalate. This is why people who are always stressed out sometimes seem to attract more illness. Humans are the same way. The internal environment of the organization is our external environment. When our external environment is threatening us, it's easy for us to go into that survival response. And in that survival response, you're shut down. And there's degrees, right? I'm talking in generalities, but there's degrees. And you can see the shutting down happen. And it's sometimes way back here, way before this pre-priming. So this pre-priming is the subconscious is always monitoring the environment, looking for threats, looking for what's going on. It makes sense when you recognize that our system has evolved based on a hunter-gatherer environment. So in a hunter-gatherer environment, you come out through a clearing of trees and you're constantly looking around. Where's the lions? Where's the tigers? What's in the air? What's on the ground? What's the surface of the ground look like, et cetera. That awareness is, so then when a threat or a stimulus happens, they are more prepared to deal with it. It's similar to if you ride a bicycle, you can drive in a car and you're coming across an intersection that looks kind of sketchy. You may cover the brake a little bit. And on the bicycle, you may put your fingers on the brake lever. On the car, you may take your foot off the accelerator. You may even cover the brake with your foot, just getting ready. And that's going to reduce your reaction time, but it's also priming you for looking for things. That little action puts you on alert for looking for that. And that's what's going on here. So when I go back to the emotional intelligence, our objective is not to be great. And I think that's what gets lost. Our objective is not to be great at emotional intelligence. It's to be great at leading people and meeting them where they are. And through that, you get the intrinsic motivation. Just by avoiding the folks going into survival mode, you will find your results will go up because there's less time that they're spending shut down. Now, all this is based on principles. And the other reason I'm pushing this dynamic leadership, and the reason I want to move it into mainstream, is because too many small businesses hire leaders. So they hire leaders when they need them. And one of the big challenges of a small business is to go from that 1 to 8 people, right? That span of control, 1 to 6, 7, 8, 10 people. Very, very difficult for them to move into where there's a leadership team, because you have to start somewhere. So you start with an office manager, but then there's conflicts and there's issues, and then that breaks down, and then if the revenue is not supporting it. So it's a bigger process to move from the owner having the 8 reports to a leadership team where you can build and scale. Dynamic leadership scales. It'll scale all the way up as big as you want. Sometimes I talk about 500 people as an ideal, but that's not because it's a max. It's that when you get above 500 people, typically there's a board involved, and the CEO, even before that, sometimes with the CEO may not have the freedom of action to do the things necessary. So said another way, the leader can do everything they in their power to maintain a safe environment for the employees on their teams. But if some of the structures that are coming down from the board or organizationally, if they're the ones that are throwing people into a fight or flight, the leader, the CEO, may not be able to do anything about it. So the point is, let's get good at leading people. Let's understand the role that emotional leadership, that emotional intelligence plays, and how it intertwines with self-determination theory. And then we go through that the guidance and accountability, and then culture. And culture we'll be talking about in February. So that's the 1 to many. Now I do this live. I go live every day from 8 a.m. to about 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, just Monday to Friday. That will pick up. So right in December, I'll tail off at the holidays. Going live on the road has its challenges, different hotels, etc. But I will be posting content regularly from past live events, and you can always go out to 7setreset.com/live. Look for the channels where I am. So I'm on Facebook and YouTube, and I go on LinkedIn once a week on Friday, typically Friday. So this was Friday's event, but the situation when I landed in Boston, it was too problematic. But but moving forward, once we hit January, Monday to Friday, you can tune in, and I welcome you to join the conversation, especially if you're involved in emotional intelligence, you're a leader, you're a trainer, you're a counselor, a coach. This is the conversation where we're moving from theory to practice, and we do that by putting it at the habit level. The obstacle that people see or believe is that you can't change habits. And that's why I created the 7-step reset. I encourage you to take a look at some of those videos. I break it down to where the 7-step reset, this is accessible. Habit change is accessible to anyone if you care enough about the objective. And this is why I always say start with purpose. It's not going to work well if you don't have a big enough why, and we need the big enough why. So I hope you'll join me. Again, I'll be promoting this to people in the Emotional Intelligence Network, people in the Leadership Think Tank, as well as leaders and people who are serving communities where intrinsic motivation is going to be powerful. By the way, when you look at intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, and you look at any list of what's most important to people, I've seen pay as low as 16 on the list. Very, very seldom. I don't think I've ever seen pay as number 1 on the list. If it's a list of 5, it'll be 3, 4, 5. List of 10, it'll be 6, 7, 8. And that's borne out by the fact that we've all seen people who leave jobs where they were paid very well, but it's just not going to do it. And you're trying to make sense of it. The point is, extrinsic motivation is not enough. You've got to have the intrinsic motivation. So said another way, our job is not to be good at emotional intelligence. Our job is to be good at setting an environment of intrinsic motivation. And that starts with ourselves. And then we extend that to how we lead people. And then we extend that to how we set the culture. So the 60 days, you can make that turnaround. Leading others, it's a process, but the more you work it and you get critical mass, and here's the thing that people forget, is that in that leadership situation, the leader has way more leverage than they expect. And this is partly why I think it's problematic for why emotional intelligence is such an important topic, because if the leader sets the tone, and if they come in a bad mood, that's going to have a leveraged exponential effect across the team, which is why the self-leadership is first. We have to get command of ourselves first. So virtually never during the workday, in work, around others, will you have a survival response, a survival reaction. And you can do that. You can get to that point. So I'm going to leave it there. I encourage you to look at some of the 7-step reset videos from the past. There's a couple on LinkedIn, and then you find them on Facebook, as well as some of them are on that website. So I put some on the website, but going live every day, there's a lot of videos. It's easier to catch them, and just go to YouTube and look for live, and then look for the ones that are about 50 minutes long, 50 to 60 minutes long. And those are the ones then I started off with an overview, and the later ones are doing one step at a time. Step 1, 2, 3. And I'm on 3 of December. I'll be going through 4, 5, 6. And I've already posted one out there on 7. I started to looking at each one on step 7. So yeah, and if you join me on stage,